Good morning, everyone. Welcome to CTEDD, the virtual conference for 2021. I'm Dr. Qisheng Pan, the director of CTEDD Center and the professor of urban planning at the University of Texas at Arlington. After several delays due to the pandemic, we at the CTEDD are very grateful to finally have the chance to bring our researchers and the community partners together for 2 days of workshops, panel discussions, and a dialogue about advancing transportation policy through stronger research, education, and the technology transfer. The main purpose of CTEDD is to promote a more equitable transportation system through research, innovation, and the community engagement. We also aim to educate the next generation of transportation planners and engineers to be more mindful of equity and the economic challenges in our city, our state, and our nation. With this in mind, we have designed this year as a series of modules to help our researchers, students, and the community stakeholders build a strong relationship between academic research and solve challenges. Our community partners are always in need of creative ideas to help them address major issues in local government, including infrastructure, budgeting, design, and many more. And our researchers also see a growing demand for studies that impact the community and coordinate with stakeholders. We hope the modules of this event bring people together to think about the issues of transportation equity and encourage them to work more closely together on research products that solve problems and make our cities, our state, our nation be more sustainable. I would like now to talk a bit about our CTEDD purpose and operations to demonstrate our potential as a resource for connecting researchers and the community. Let me share with you the introduction to our CTEDD Center. James, there's some technical issue. Okay, now it's fine. Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen about the CTEDD 2021 Advancing Transportation. I'm the director of the CTEDD Center, and I share this event with program manager, Dr. James Wood, who hosts the whole virtual event. Let me move to the next page. Okay. As you may know, CTEDD is a Tier 1 university transportation center sponsored by United States Department of Transportation, US DOT. Our mission includes multiple components. CTEDD is a consortium of 5 universities leading transportation policy research that improve economic development through more efficient, cost-effective ways of existing transportation system and provide better access to jobs and many other opportunities. CTEDD will address this lead through innovative application of cutting-edge technologies and advanced policy that harness private resources for public infrastructure. Our CTEDD and the consortium members aim to serve our fast-growing regions and the nation through different programs that extend economic prosperity, provide outreach to policymakers, and address infrastructure needs through innovative method, educate future leaders of the transportation field. CTEDD has a vision to lead the transition of our out-of-date transportation system toward the future through advanced policy making and the cutting-edge technology. first mentioned, our CTEDD Center has 5 consortium members. Its headquarters located in University of Texas at Arlington, UTA, and also has the members of University of South Florida, USF, Georgia Tech, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Our center has over 75 active faculty members from different disciplines, including urban planning, public affairs, engineering, social work, and many others. Since 2017, we have launched over 70 research projects and allocated more than 6 million research grants and secure over 4.1 million matching funds from universities, communities, and industrial partners. We have trained over 7 graduate students and mentor 5,180 high school students on transportation and STEM career in Dallas-Fort Worth area. We also created a graduate certificate program in transportation planning and policy, the TPP program. I will introduce that later. So we have a very strong CTEDD leadership and very competent personnel. I'm Qisheng Pan, the director of the center. We also have Dr. Jay Rosenberg from the industrial engineering at the UTA as the deputy director. Dr. Rosenberg also served as the interim director last year, and he's very actually active in the administrative work at the center before and also at this time. Dr. Stephen Mattingly is the associate director on research. He's from the civil engineering department at the UTA. He also served as the associate director of the NISA Center located at Portland State. He's very active in research from Techstar and many other agencies. And Dr. Yvonne Aldrich is our associate director of education. She's the faculty member, the College of Architecture, Planning, Public Affairs, CAPA at the UTA. We also have executive committee members from our consortium partners, Phil Winter from University of South Florida, Anurag Pandey from Cal Poly, Bru from Georgia Tech, So-Young An from University of Wisconsin-Madison. As I mentioned, that we have a very competent staff. Dr. James Wood is the program manager. Actually, he set up the whole virtual event, and he's supported by Roya, the postdoctoral research lead, and Kidra Wilson, our administrative assistant, to make this event happen and also ensure the smooth actually progress of this event. Just introduce a bit about myself. I'm Qisheng Pan, the CTEDD director. I had training in both planning and engineering. I received a PhD in planning and a master in computer science, both from University of Southern California, USC. I also received a master in cartography and remote sensing and a bachelor in geology from Peking University. In addition to be the CTEDD director, I'm also a full professor in Department of Public Affairs and Planning at the UTA. Before I joined UTA, I was a full professor in Department of Urban Planning and Environmental Policy at the Texas Southern University. Actually, I'm one of the founding member of that department, which is the very first planning department in the 4th largest city of the United States, Houston. Actually, my research focused on many different areas related to economic impact analysis. I serve as the principal investigator or the co-principal investigator of over 12 research projects, 7 consultant projects, and secure over 1.3 million fund in transportation studies from Department of Transportation, Texas Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, National Science Foundation, Kaufman Foundation, and many others. Those are, work done before I joined the UTA. Actually, before I appointed as a director of the CTEDD Center, I also administrative, work. I serve as the department chair of Department of Urban Planning and the Environmental Policy at Texas Southern University for 80 years. On my turn, I led the planning program, gained the initial accreditation and the reaccreditation. Our reaccreditation is 7 year long. Actually, the term is 7 years. Is the longest term, awarded by the Planning Accreditation Board, PAB. I would like to update you about the recent and ongoing research in our center. We have a very active research portfolio. The CTEDD always have about like 20 active projects at any given time. Last year, we completed 13 projects. And we have the annual RFP announced to our consortium members for research projects. The funding rate is about 1 out of 3. Currently, actually, CTEDD has an ongoing active educational RFP, which is due next week. CTEDD will also start 2021 general RFP in this coming fall and award about 1 million research grant to our consortium members. And last year, we start transportation planning and the policies program, the TPP program, by the UTA College of Planning and Public Affairs, CAPA, and the College of Engineering. Dr. Yvonne Aldrich from the College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs, CAPA, administrate this program. It has a mix of required courses and the electives, and the core course, the 4 core courses actually taught by our CTEDD and also the CAPA personnel. As I just mentioned, actually in March, our CTEDD launched educational RFP designated to educational initiatives focusing on 3 areas: K-12 education, college, university education, community and workforce development. And the proposals are designed for rapid implementation that with substantial ties to educational industry partners. The sample actually topic of the project include the training modules, curriculum course update, low-cost textbook development, and the K-12 transportation initiatives. About the low-cost, our CTEDD Center also serve as a platform actually for the educational initiatives from our faculty members. For example, Dr. Yvonne actually Aldrich recently received an award from the Department of Education on Open Education Resource OER grant, which is also a no-cost textbook development program. And educational RFP is due next week. If you are a faculty member or researcher who are interested in interested in the proposal, please keep in mind of this deadline. And the CTEDD also provide scholarships and also name student of the year. Last year, we have distributed 13,600 scholarships to 9 students crossing the consortium members, including thesis dissertation scholarship. Actually, we have 2 students receive that scholarship from UTA and 3 from Georgia Tech. We also actually distributed the student transportation scholarship one of the UTA students received that scholarship last year. We also have one student from University of Wisconsin-Madison and 2 students from University of South Florida receive a student transition scholarship. Ms. Ledan Mozfarin, actually from the College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs at the UTA, was named as the CTEDD the Student of the Year in 2020. Ledan actually was selected by our leadership team as the student researcher who best represent the CTEDD spirit of student accomplishment. Our CTEDD also has, scholarships. Actually, in 2021 to 2022 academic year, we have 3 categories of competitive scholarship available for qualifying students, including student transition scholarship up to 1,000, and the thesis dissertation scholarship up to 1,800, and the internship scholarship to fund the internship stipend up to 2,000. There are some requirements which are very general. For example, students need to enroll in one of our 5 consortium university, and the student need to submit an application with supporting document, and the student must be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. It's a friendly reminder, actually, if you are a student interested in CTEDD scholarship, the due date is tomorrow. And we also have Equity in Motion podcast, which is hosted by James Wood, our program manager. We have a series of podcast episodes available to the public. Each episode features a discussion with 1 or 2 transportation experts, generally on the topic of equity in transportation. The episode will promote our research, but also actually aim at a general audience. If you are interested in the Equity in Motion podcast, please actually contact Dr. James Wood, our program manager. Actually, CTEDD is also facing many actually strategic challenges in the coming year. For example, actually to enrich our community ties by growing actually a CTEDD project with community stakeholders and partners. We also need to improve technology transfer and the long-term impact of our CTEDD research. Not just publish papers or give presentations. We need to measure the policy impact derived from our funded project. We also need to grow the TPP certificate program as an enduring actually practitioner resource by growing the enrollment and the graduates of our CTEDD TPP certificate. We also need to aid as an internship clearinghouse for transition-focused students by increasing the transition-focused student working in summer internship. We also need to ensure the success of our 2021 research RFP by actually significantly increasing the participation of faculty from UTA and the other consortium members. That's just a short introduction about our CTEDD Center. And if you are interested in our actually previous and ongoing event and the future opportunities, please feel free to contact us. We also have a social media, including Facebook, Twitter, to broadcast our CTEDD event and activities. So that's the introduction of the CTEDD Center. We hope actually you enjoy these 2 days of workshop and session, and we are proud to support your growth as researchers and community leaders. Our first session, starting in just a few minutes, is a panel discussion on transit justice in Dallas-Fort Worth area and beyond, which will be moderated by Dr. Diane Jones Allen from the College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs at the UTA. Thank you and enjoy our event.
Thank you, Dr. Pan. It looks like the panelists for the next session have not yet arrived. So if people could continue to wait, or if anyone has any questions so far about what Dr. Pan has presented, maybe we could answer those while we wait.
Sure.
There's a question from, two questions. I'll start with emerging trends. You could speak.
Yeah, this is Jeff Davis. I'm a panelist, I think, on the next program. I didn't know I was not attached.
Oh, hello, Mr. Davis. I'll go ahead and add you to the panel. And then Victor Fishman, was there a question from Victor Fishman?
I was just curious if Dr. Pan could say a little bit more about the TPP program.
Yeah, actually, the TPP program was launched last year, which is administered by Yvonne Aldrich, actually from the Kappa. Actually, the program, we actually opened that program to the UTA enrolled student. Actually, after they take the core course and some inactive courses from the Kappa and the College of Engineering, they will receive the TPP certificate from the program, and that program will actually promote the transportation planning and the policy to the UTA student. If you wanted to learn more about the TPP program, you can go to the website, and also Dr. Aldrich would be more than happy to answer the detailed questions.
Yeah, so one of the purposes of the certificate is to help current students to gain more understanding of transportation issues while they're still in school before they go out into the profession. But it's also, because a lot of the courses are taught in the evening, it's also a possibility for working professionals to come back and take a few specific courses on transportation without enrolling in a full master's program. So it's a way to help mid-career professionals as well. And there are a few required courses on the basics of transportation, but most of it is elective. So there are required courses in demand modeling and transportation engineering, the technical stuff, but also, electives on social work classes for older people or people with disabilities, or planning for electric vehicles. It's a pretty open collection of courses people can choose from, but it's designed for both students and working professionals, and it's open to both populations.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Do you have any other question, comments, or suggestions? We still have a few minutes. Yeah.
And we also have Jon Killen is now here. He's one of our other panelists. Looks like we're just waiting on Diane. She will lead the discussion. And that panel topic, by the way, is transit justice in DFW and beyond. And Dr. Allen knows much more about the concept than I do, but transit justice, if you'll recall, is going beyond just equity. CTEDD focuses on equity under our federal charter, but now within the community, within the literature, people are talking more about justice, which is a deeper, more transformative social issue. So she is sort of a growing expert in that area. And we have Jeff Davis, who's a community leader in Fort Worth, and Jon Killen, who's a similar icon, a little bit younger, but he's up and coming in the Dallas transit system, DART. And they both, I think, bring really interesting perspectives. And Dr. Allen is a published author on the concept of transit deserts, which is similar to what urban planners call food deserts, where neighborhoods that don't have access to grocery stores or healthy food options tend to have measurably poorer health outcomes and life expectancy. She found a parallel relationship with transit access. Neighborhoods that don't have a bus stop or a train line or even something like a sidewalk, they have measurably lower health outcomes and job access outcomes. So she's very active in the area of community empowerment, infrastructure restoration after disasters. And it looks like she's got a really interesting set of questions. I hope we can get into it here in just a minute.
Mhm.
And I'm really looking forward to learning. And no one has said anything back. I'm like, what a quiet group. Are they going to answer my questions? And it's because I was muted.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Oh, yes. So I was asking, are we waiting until people join? Because it starts at 10 or?
it looks like people are coming in and moving in and out for the different sessions. So
Oh,
I guess
okay.
we could go ahead and wait until the clock strikes 10. But
Just a minute.
yeah, it's hopefully an interesting conversation. In non-COVID times, we would have this sort of thing on the UTA campus with an auditorium with students to discuss it. And it's a topic, it's relatively recent. Its growth is recent in the literature, and it's very active with the student community. I don't know much about it. I studied older people in transportation, so issues of justice and socioeconomic equality weren't really in my subject area, but they're in Dr. Allen's area. She's our resident expert on the topic, and we're more than happy to have her take the lead on this. So Dr. Allen, I'll hand it over to you at this point and mute myself.
So thank you. What I like before I start asking questions, I think I would like each of, just because there are people that are joining us, and thank you for everyone who's joining us. I'd like our two guests or the panel to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about yourselves, and then I'll start with a question. And then we can go from there. James was saying, I'm a professor in landscape architecture, although I have a doctorate in transportation engineering. And basically I look at transportation deserts, which are, or transit deserts, which are places of limited access but high demand. And it's usually based along equity because it's related to where people live. Anyway, so I'm very much interested in transit justice. I think transportation should be a civil right because you have to get to work, you have to get to, and especially as times change and we move into the future and we're really thinking about sustainability, we're realizing finally the country that, mass transit is a way to protect the environment, less carbon, less vehicles, walkability, all the wonderful things. So enough about me. So let's start with our first panelists. If we want to start with John, if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then our next panelist.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jon Killen. I am representing DART. I represent the city of Dallas on the Dallas Area Rapid Transit Board, and DART is the transportation entity that serves a big portion of Dallas County. So we have 13 member cities. And like I said, I am representing the city of Dallas. I joined the DART board about 4 years ago and was just recently reappointed for another 2-year term. So I'll be hanging around for a little while longer. I came to DART as someone with very little transportation experience. Most of my transportation experience came from riding the school bus in middle school. I grew up in Arlington, Texas, where CTEDD has a home at UTA and is famous for its lack of mass transit availability. And so once I went to Dallas for college and lived in the community, I came with, like I said, like very little transit experience. But my career is in business intelligence, where I'm a consultant helping other people make good decisions with the use of data. And so that is the skill set and perspective I bring to the DART board. And very excited to have the opportunity to serve, because DART is in a really promising place where we are ending some large capital programs and really beginning to focus on how we can be a better operating entity. And so it's exciting to be a part of that shift.
Very good. Thank you. I wish DART could like bring the light rail, to Arlington or something, connect. But anyway, something that needs to be worked on. Our next guest, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Jeff Davis. I'm the current chair of Trinity Metro. I got the bug about 10 years ago. I'm a political junkie, and suddenly I realized how important transit was to shaping cities, and was working on the streetcar initiative in Fort Worth. Ultimately, the grant, the New Starts grant, was given back to COG, and they gave it to Dallas. And so they built the Bishop Arts extension of the streetcar, which was very successful. Not much ridership, but the development around there has been extraordinary. So I'm just kind of a political guy, and got on the board to build TexRail because it was languishing 5 or 6 years ago, and the city council turned the board over, and I had an interest, and now I'm the chair and really begin to understand the importance of transit for lifting everybody up. And my day job is I'm with a title company, Republic Title. I'm an attorney. I'm one of the old white guys that can figure out, understand the importance of transit for everybody. It's a hard slog in Fort Worth, because in 1980 we passed a half-cent sales tax. Same time DART got a full penny, and we spend $71 in operating capital per capita, and DART spends $254, Austin $191. And we started our journey then, and it's really, with such limited resources, the greatest demand was in East Fort Worth, the lower income areas. And so that's inside the loop has been where our service has primarily been. We're trying to expand that and really begin to be an important player in economic development. And there are many other statistics, I think, that will show that we're pretty much a suburb of Dallas currently, and that's not a good thing.
Thank you. So I think both of you a little touched on my next question. So I'm kind of combine the next two questions. So could each of you describe what transit justice means for you? And then how does that differ or relate to, I think it more relates to, but how does it differ or relate to transit equity? And with that, you can talk a little bit about how do you think policy makers can include this or make a difference. So John, if you want to start.
Sure. I joined the meeting a few minutes early, so I overheard, James talking with some of his colleagues about this idea of transit justice and being a new concept, and it was new to me. Transit equity was kind of a phrase and term that I've heard in the few years that I've been on board, but a quick Google search, right? These are not my thoughts, but Googling, right? There are Transit Center, which is a group that I follow quite closely. And there's a National Transit Justice Center that has all these ideas and framework for what transit justice is supposed to be. I would just direct everyone to go look at their stuff because they're not my original thoughts. And so what I would say my perspective as a board member is, I would say now is a time of reckoning for DART. And I won't speak for any of the other transit agencies, especially since we have someone else on the line that can do that, just as well. I think for DART, for so long, our perspective has been kind of two different things. We've been really focused on trying to build out rail lines for the sake of building rail lines, not for any other specific purpose, but because there was a mandate from our community when we were created, 30, almost 40 years ago, to build out these rail lines. And at a certain point, we realized that these rail lines were not necessarily giving us the ridership that we thought it would give us, and even the economic development around those stations. It wasn't what we thought it was going to be, but we pressed on. And now that we are at the tail end of building out our light rail systems and our commuter rail system, now we have all this money and we have to rethink what our purpose is. And I think equity and justice, matter a lot more to the agency than it did before. The people who represent the board care a lot more about making sure that all of the communities are well served, that we're not trying to serve people on the board like myself and try to figure out how do you get, someone with dual incomes and 2 cars out of their car and onto a bus, because that may be really difficult. But how could we better serve those individuals who are paying a higher % of their income in sales tax for service, while also starving those people for resources, right? And so the idea of equity and justice are really net new, I think, for our agency, right? I think every agency probably has like a Title VI analysis that says you have to be sure that you're doing following federal law, right? And so when I joined the board and we had a Title VI analysis, which was around our fare increases, I just knew the fare increase would fail in terms of matching federal policy, because we were raising fares 20%. And that's really difficult for a lot of people to go up 20% at one time. But federal law basically says, as long as you're doing the same thing to everybody, then that's fair, right? Like that passes muster. It doesn't matter if, a 20% increase, from $5 to $6, that matters a lot less to someone making $100,000 a year versus someone who makes $20,000 a year. But so long as it's the same 20% increase for everybody, you could theoretically raise it by $100 a day for fare. And so that's when I realized, the policies that exist today on the books are not going to be sufficient for us. We can't expect anyone else but our agencies to really take a very close look at ensuring that we have affordable systems, that we're investing in those communities who are our best customers, who are riding us the most in the first place, that we don't offer, on-demand Uber type services in really wealthy communities because they say they want it, but not in low-income communities who may also want it, or who may have more bus service, but it's a lot slower, right? And so trying to tie all those things together is really difficult if you don't have a justice and equity framework. And so I'm hopeful with the new CEO that we have coming in, we can make that a focus for her, is to ensure, like a lot of school districts now have like chief equity officers, right? We don't have anything like that at DART. And so I'm hoping that sort of thing is something that we can bring to mind, so that all of our big decisions we can look at through, I keep saying equity because that's the language I know, but I definitely want to learn more from you about, the justice framework. But that's what I'm thinking as a board member.
You gave such a really wonderful, tangible example of equity, when you just talked about how, okay, we raise the fares fairly across the board, but is it equitable? Because, some communities don't, like you said, some people are making 200,000 and some people are making 20,000. So it's not really equitable, right? So you might have to, make a difference in the different areas. Maybe you have to have different fares for different regions or something based on demographics or whatever to make, equity requires something additional. But I just thought that was such a, just real tangible, because most of the times when people, they use the one of people looking over a fence, but I was like, oh, that's a good transit example of equity. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So Jeff, why don't you talk to us about your views and Trinity Metro?
Well, like John, I was Googling last night, transit justice, and it was really fun. And because of my experience, it really amounts, in my mind, to an enhancement of our equity principles, just recognizing where we've come. When you build a road, when you built Interstate 35 South, when you built IH-30, TxDOT literally tried to elevate the freeway in our downtown area without any understanding of what that would do to our community. So over the years, you have these communities that have been divided. I think not by design, but they just build roads. And roads do define communities. And what happens, for example, in 76104, which is one of our transit desert areas, food desert areas, is that major freeway was just an impediment to movement. And because of the construction of the housing, you didn't have any major thoroughfares there, and you couldn't operate a bus, a 40-footer. And so what happens to that area? You have to recognize it. You have to serve that area. You can't operate the 40-footer and get good ridership, but what you can do is you can serve it with a transportation network company via door-to-door service. And that's what we've done in that particular area. The 76104 needed that kind of service. And before we recognized exactly how bad it was, we extended the service that was in the medical district over to 76104. So, you know, communities have been isolated many times by engineers who just didn't know any better. And we have to recognize that in order to fix that, we have to offer those coverage services to people that really need them. We're trying to do it. I know DART has done a really good job. We're both reimagining our bus systems at the same time. We've got Christoph Spieler. DART has Jarrett Walker. These are two well-renowned folks to get people to where they really need to go. I will say, one of your questions was talking about getting people to jobs, and you just have to recognize where the jobs are. So in this reimagination process, we make straight lines to where people can go to jobs and not necessarily get to a transfer station. It's a recognition that we have a lot more work to do than we thought we did. And I really do think that we're at a pivotal moment in transit. I think because President Biden had day one had said we need to change the decision-making capabilities of all transit planning. We need to be more inclusive. We need to create jobs with all of this. So, you know, when I think of what justice is, I think it's equity enhancement. It's doing the kinds of things that we should have been doing before. And the key is finding the money to really provide more service. And DART has had a ton of money, and I think John was right, built out everything they could, and now they got to realize they need to start connecting people to their jobs.
Great, and you actually answered some of the questions. And one thing, though, that you touched upon at the very beginning was roads. In terms of equity, I was having a conversation with someone in Arlington, I won't say who, and they were saying, well, you know, the people don't want to really subsidize, you know, public transit riders, you know, should they get extra, you know, because you do, all transit is mainly is subsidized, you know, the fares do not pay for all the things you need within transit, infrastructure, vehicles, you know, work drivers, all that. So and it rightly should be subsidized. I mean, that could be a whole discussion, should it be, but that was the point. So they were like, we are not going to subsidize all that. You know, we're going to think of other ways, the public-private partnership like they have now with VIA in Arlington. But my retort to that was, but you subsidize me. I drive my car. The minute I get into my car, I'm subsidized. She said, what were you talking? Are you talking about the gas tax you pay? I said, no. I said, I drive on a road in Arlington, and that road is paid for with public dollars. And I stop at a stoplight, you know, which I need, you know, and that's paid for with public money. I said, drivers are subsidized more than any other, you know, transportation rider or participant. People who drive cars were totally subsidized because the road is a system, right? And that system is paid for federal, local, and state dollars. So I'm subsidized and so why shouldn't transit riders be? People who it's a choice, right? Why shouldn't people who choose not to have vehicles get the same subsidy that I get? So, that is a thing about, how people perceive this. So to get to the question for you all. So, historically, why do you think things are kind of divided up and, funds are allocated the way they are? And what are the things that we can do to thinking about this anew, thinking about getting people to work, thinking about, connecting, and thinking about how things are funded. John?
We'll talk about Arlington too.
Yeah.
Yes, we talk about.
I'm happy to talk about Arlington. It is my dear hometown.
Arlington sits
nope.
right in the middle. Just think of Arlington had transit, like such a hub. But anyway.
I was always disappointed and would come home from college, I think twice, to try to vote for the transit elections, and it hadn't worked out before in the past. I would say that you could draw a pretty straight line to our lack of funding for transit to race and our unwillingness as communities to invest in things that we think Black and Brown communities would benefit for at the exclusion of other communities, right? I think today, if DART had to start over, could we convince some of the same member cities to rejoin DART for a full penny if we were only talking about bus? And I think the answer is no, right? Most of our cities joined with the idea of light rail because they could imagine themselves and their constituents and residents as riders of those systems, right? They didn't join thinking, man, I'm happy to stay here for 30, 40 years if it's just bus. And a lot of that is because we think of bus riders very differently than we think of the people who ride light rail and the people who ride commuter rail. It's unfortunate, but it is the way it is, and why I think Arlington has been so resistant to mass transit. Yes, they have VIA, but you just can't move that many people, right, in small vehicles. It's impossible and not economical, right? The more people that you have riding those on-demand type services, the scale quickly overwhelms itself. If it gets really popular, you need more drivers. If you need more drivers, it gets really expensive. And so at some point, you have to cap and have a contract that says, do not spend more than X number of dollars. Otherwise, we'll go over the budget that we said we didn't want to spend. And so, I think race is a big part of it. Unfortunately, is that just a unwillingness to really invest in those resources, and specifically bus. I think the conversations about investing in bus and really trying to make it better, when a lot of the people who serve on boards and a lot of the people who run the agencies and a lot of the people who are in positions of power, when they don't see themselves using that service, or their friends or their families or people who live in their neighborhoods, they might have some difficulty, right, trying to find the value. But, we've come a long way, right? Now the pandemic has shown us that, if you want people to work at Target so that you can still go get your essentials, you need people to work there. And those people get to work in a lot of cases using public transit. A lot of the people who work at our hospitals and airports, and even need to get to places for care, really utilize our public transit systems. And so between that and trying to, as you mentioned earlier, trying to ensure that we have a cleaner environment, less cars on the road, it's a lot cheaper than trying to build out more and more roads or more highways, that we can really create the density in our cities and become more sustainable if we invest in transit, right? There's more studies, there's more evidence that show if you've got high quality transit, like in Seattle, it doesn't have to be, a light rail or fixed, guideway system. It can be a really high quality bus, and development will come around it. It's really about, do you have a corridor where lots of people can use the thing? And so I think all of those things are coming together now that make it a lot easier and digestible for folks to prepare themselves to make those investments. And so, we saw a great success in Austin, where they just recently passed, I can't remember if it was a bond, but it was certainly more financing for their system. I'm hopeful for Fort Worth that as they prepare whatever kind of funding mechanisms they go for, that they'll be able to take those things forward. And I don't want to steal any of Jeff's don't want to steal any of Jeff's thunder, because I don't know what Fort Worth is doing. But as they prepare to try to go seek more money, I think it's going to be an easier conversation for them than it would have been just 10 years ago.
Okay, Jeff.
It's a struggle. Yeah, John's absolutely right on the perception of the bus. In fact, there's an article in the Atlantic by Jarrett Walker talking about the bus is still the best, the backbone of every transit system. 80% of all transportation in the United States is by bus. So, the people in Arlington, and I'm not trying to pick on them, they turned it down twice. That's their prerogative. On the other hand, they really need to understand public transportation and who it serves and how it can lift their community up too. We're trying to work with Arlington and to see if they have an appetite. Michael Morris has said that at some point Arlington is going to have their own transportation system or contract for services, or they're not going to get a stop on high-speed rail. So, when you move 2 to 3 people an hour with VIA versus, 10 to 60 with a bus, you've got to make some decisions about what kind of community you want to move. And reminds me of 2017 when Federal Express and UPS attended a public hearing for the city council. And ironic, they were both there talking about they've built systems, built jobs in every city and region in the United States. But in Tarrant County, Texas, it's the only place where they can't get their people to work. So that's it's a large task because the city council in Fort Worth didn't commit any funds from their general revenues to provide that kind of service, even in the last budget, where one of the council folks of color said, that's a want, not a need, moving people to their jobs. And it was a $2 million ask for frequent service to Alliance and to Amazon. And, when you hear that from a councilwoman of color, you just kind of get despondent and understand the chasm that exists between communication problem of getting people to understand that you need to lift all people up with a bus and with a system, which can involve rail, but it's pretty expensive.
I think, your answers get really, at the heart of like transit diversity, right? We're all talking about diversity now in education and all kinds of, but we really need diversity in transit, right? I mean, yes, there'll probably always be cars. I mean, I had a studio this past semester, the Green New Deal Super Studio, where we looked at jobs, justice, and decarbonization. And we've invited General Motors of Arlington to come and talk to us. And they accepted the invitation, knowing what we were looking at, that we were looking at the Green New Deal. And it was wonderful because they really, they've been way ahead. The technology's been there. And, they were willing to admit that, yes, they are looking like 2030, they want to be all electric. And they realize that, they're even thinking about road diets, that these electric cars will be stored somewhere, and I was saying, yeah, it's kind of like a transit system almost. And so the thing is, they realize, car manufacturers realize this, that we have to have transit diversity, that in the future, we'll probably have electric vehicles that people rent or whatever. And there also has to be, larger vehicles, there has to be something like buses and rail and, because there has to be diversity. And I think that's the problem is that, especially here, like in Arlington, where I am, as an example, because there are many Arlingtons across the country, in places that feel like, okay, having automobiles and maybe having VIA is enough, but you have to have diversity because you have a diversity of constituents, like transit deserts. What I've been studying is about, you have hidden populations. I mean, all of Arlington is there are hidden populations of people and they find ways like, in Baltimore, they do something where that's illegal, but they do it and the government just kind of ignores it. It's called hacking. And this is something like the gypsy cabs of Chicago where people, they just double up, they pay their neighbor, and they, people find ways to live in a place in a transit desert, but should they have to go through all this? So my question is then, how do we, and how are your agencies thinking about, transit diversity and how we reach these hidden populations and, how we determine where transit goes? Okay, so the last thing I'll say, because I'm talking too much. Yeah. This is your.
No, I think it's fine to the way you're kind of setting up and giving us some ideas that to work with. I think, so both agencies, right, are going through a system redesign, primarily bus system redesign. We can't redesign our rails other than to run them more frequently. So we're really looking at our bus and our on-demand. And that means like you have to go to the community to learn a little bit more. Like you can do quite a bit of stuff, with, software tools and looking at census and, seeing where job centers are and working with the chamber. And those are all things you should do. But at the end of the day, you still have to go out to the community. And I think speaking for DART, when we go to the community, it's generally not a positive message. When we rent out the neighborhood center or come to the library, it's usually to tell you that the route, near you, the ridership is dwindling. And so we're going to cut that route or reorganize it. Or we're coming to your community to tell you that fares are going up, right? Because we haven't done redesigns like this before, and because we typically spend less money every year on transit as opposed to more, we're typically not going to communities and saying, hey, we're coming to make your life better. We're coming to add some service where we think it's needed. And so we want to hear from you. And so even though now we are coming to communities with, the purest of intentions to redesign the system to make it better, to prepare to spend more money on service, they're looking at us critically. And so we have to balance some of the input that we're getting from our communities, because we may tell them, hey, it's faster for you to walk an extra 3 blocks to get to a much faster bus. If they're 2 buses and they're both, a quarter mile apart, and we say we can combine those buses so that it goes twice as fast, you just have to walk a little bit longer to get to that bus. Well, most people have never experienced that before. They've never seen a consolidation that led to an increase in service. And so for us to tell them that, hey, we want your opinion. Would you rather have 1 bus that's much faster or 2 that are closer to you? We may feel like we know the right answer kind of paternalistically, but you want to respect and respond to the community. And so that's a challenge that I know DART is facing as we enter the very, very last phases of our system redesign. When it comes to a diversity of rider, again, we know we're supposed to hear more from those communities, both that ride our system as well as those who don't ride, that we wish they would. But frankly, in my opinion, we've always been more focused on trying to attract people who were simply never going to ride our system very frequently. We would say, hey, how do we get that person that works at AT&T downtown to ride the bus and rail more frequently, right? Like, how do we get that person that came to the Mavericks game or to State Fair that one time to ride all the time? And so how do we put Wi-Fi on the trains, and do we need to beef up security to make that person feel safe? And do we need to have really nice cloth seats on our express buses? And we put all the attention and focus on those folks who simply have the option of driving a luxury car to work, and so they're probably just not going to spend that much time using our services, instead of looking the other way at individuals who would rather say, you know what, I can't wait on this 40-minute bus, so I'm going to instead go buy a $2,000, junk car that I hope can get me to work reliably. Instead of going to those people and trying to figure out what do we need to do to get that rider back on the system, it's like we turned and went the other way and said, how do we get those really, really hard customers, right? And so even if we want to take a business angle to this and say, hey, what's the cost of acquiring a customer? We toss that idea out the window and say, let me just go try to get my neighbor to ride, instead of how do I get those people who were already riders back on the system? So I know that is changing, but just historically, I know that's how DART operated, and I assume how a lot of transit agencies have operated just because of the composition of the board, right? If you don't have people who ride the system on the board or who represent those people, then you have a hard time having folks that advocate and look out for them. And I'll stop there because I get fired up about that. I'm curious to hear Jeff's thoughts.
It's great, because it really is about access. Yeah. Jeff?
As usual, John, spot on. We're having that same discussion about really walking a little further, having more frequency, straightening out the routes. And we found through as much, not just social media, neighborhood papers, but also by our onboarding, where we send people out to do this research and ask them what they want. And it does make a difference. If in fact, some of our final recommendations have contained thoughts from the riders, which is a big deal because they ride it every day. But don't forget that the drivers too. We've made an effort in our reimagination to also work with the drivers, who have been a great resource for changing some of the routes. And what John is talking about is what we call at Trinity Metro is getting Harrison on the bus. Harrison's a guy that never rides, but Charlie Guerin, who's a state rep, told me a few years ago, I said, I'm never going to get anybody in the west side of my Fort Worth community. They'll never ride the bus. Well, the reason is they don't have any service. They don't have any frequency. And we all know that if you give folks frequency, your ridership will be successful. But with cutback and funding, that's what we're trying to do, is use the same amount of funds, but increase frequency with our network. And you mentioned other modes of transit, the diversity and options. I think that's a big deal. Creating sidewalks, bus stops that are accessible. Bicycles are a wonderful way to access transit, but walking is absolutely the best. So we really need an overall approach to making it everything work together. And we all know that first mile, last mile is very difficult. But this TNC model, the VIA, it really is a way to get people to the major corridors where they can catch a train or a bus. And better yet, as I mentioned, walk if you can. And in our reimagination, we're getting people closer to that quarter mile walk, 79,000 people closer to being able to get to that more frequent bus.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, things like VIA and circulators are really good in terms of having diversity. Because, in neighborhoods that have suburban form, they can, go around, they don't have to be on a grid, they can go around. But it's great is that, just like you said, if there's something for them to connect to, right? If on the arterial, there was a rapid bus system, so I just think that Arlington's is kind of missing the other piece, because VIA is great. Now you need the other piece, something to.
So I'm having a meeting in the morning with Jeff Williams. We'll see how that goes.
Yes. So you both of you gave some good examples. You're talking about, like thinking about, okay, so how do we get to people, and maybe rethinking even how we, calculate demand. Usually we use the traditional demand forecasting, but I think there's other ways to do that, like being more catalytic. But John, so we have on here, and this is for both of you, of course, or we have on here, and Jeff. So Jeff, I'll let you start. We have on here, because this is CTEDD, which is wonderful because it's multidisciplinary. So we have architects and engineers, and planners, sociologists, public policy people, so what do you think, in order to implement and push some of these ideas, what do you think, our researchers and students and faculty should be looking at in terms of transit that would be helpful to moving these ideas? What should they be studying to help move these ideas forward?
We use certain statistics to create I guess the educational process of how many people we get to the COVID vaccinations, how many people we move for free for job interviews, how many access people we move for people with disabilities. That data is really important, and how many people you get to jobs too, how that works. One thing I haven't seen, and I'm sure it's out there, but what lifts everybody up is a data of economic development. How many jobs were created? How many jobs were you able to get to? What kind of transit-oriented development are you able to create without too much displacement in certain areas? That how much actually does it cost to build and maintain a road? We're building roads in Tarrant County and Fort Worth that by the time their bonds are paid off, you got to replace them again, which isn't very thoughtful policy. So if we had more data, for lack of a better word, it's return on investment, and there's the APTA study, which is for every dollar you spend, you get $4 in return. But if you could drill down on the cost of a road and continue moving, and I think we're having some success. I don't know why. Even in Texas, Tex.now is starting to say, well, maybe transit is a good idea. And we just have to keep pounding that idea of the climate change, of the cost of roads, of induced demand, of what are you guys trying to sell us from the private sector, which will never work and which some cities are buying into for real honest transit. Those are the kinds of things, if we could get CTEDD to help us with, I think it would really help the policy. It would help me because I spend half my time trying to give data to members of a city council and the mayor. They don't really care, they just don't care. So some do, but most of them by and large, and even some of the council folks, they have different agendas. All they want to do is get reelected, and I'm talking all of them, even the people of color, and they're not willing to rock the boat to get public transportation like they ought to be, pounding their shoe on the table to get more money for their district, more service, and figure out a way to do it. It requires political courage, and that's rare in many policymakers' positions.
Thank you so much for that, because I'm sure the director of CTEDD and everyone else, we're all like, great, we want to do these things. Thank you. You'll probably be getting a bunch of calls now with offers for data. Good. Okay, John, what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that one way for research is to, I guess, just to be more influential ultimately, is first use the example, which is that, we know that CTEDD was had a very influential research that was done on DART, I think in 2017 or so, which is right when I joined the board. And I want to say that having gone out to meet with the researchers at CTEDD, it was really helpful for me because it really helped build a narrative around how DART was doing, how we needed to do better. And it was the fact that it was in the media more than anything. I think if they'd done the research and sent it via email to DART to download and read at their leisure, it would have gone to die, right? But the fact that it was in the media forced both DART and the city council to really try to respond to it. And so I think to the extent that you can build a narrative that can get the attention of the media is one way of doing things, to really capture the imagination and force a conversation. I think the other is to take advantage of, specifically in Tarrant County, there's a group called the Tarrant Transit Alliance that is forming. Again, I can't speak for Jeff. I don't know enough about it, but I know there are lots of other types of alliances and coalitions that exist to really promote transit for a number of different reasons, but in this case, right, to promote transit. And so to help latch on and provide the information so that those groups can then turn that into political willpower, right? Because those are the groups that, the transit alliances, the coalitions in Dallas called Coalition for a New Dallas. Those are the folks who actually go out and vet and interview candidates and give stamps of approval and provide different types of support. And so if you can provide some influence and support to those coalitions and those focus groups that are focused on transit, then they can do the heavy lifting of actually connecting with the policymakers, right? Because if you're a researcher and you've got .edu at the end of your email and you send it to someone at the city, it's probably not going to do nearly as much as if that email was from the Chamber of Commerce, right? And so it is what it is, but you have to be able to get to the people who can influence the decision makers. And so I think both the media and those coalition groups can help you go a long way. And so I think developing relations with them and providing them the information that they need to be successful in what they're advocating for would be a great way to really influence and put your research to good use.
Thank you. That's great. So I don't know how we're doing for time. James can let me know. But what I want to do now, so we don't run over because it's 10:43, that we actually have some questions in the chat and in the Q&A. So I'll start with the chat question, or well, maybe I'll start with the Q&A question because they were first, and then I'll go to the chat person. Don't you worry, I'm coming to you. And the chat question was, and Jeff, you can start with this. Do you think shared autonomous vehicles solve the problem of spending on drivers? And does that make services like VIA more sustainable and equitable?
I'm not sure what the first part of that question again.
Do you think autonomous vehicles, I guess things like VIA autonomous vehicles,
right,
share, solve the problem of spending on drivers? And does that make services like VIA more sustainable and equitable?
It's funny. I'm a friend of one of the folks at GM who was in Arlington, and he told me in 2017 that by 2020 that the GM would have a fleet of autonomous vehicles. Well, guess what? That didn't happen. The Denver RTD did in 2018 study said they're not ready for prime time. And so to start with, this is a really, without a controlled environment, it's going to be really hard to have a successful autonomous driving capability that's universal. We'll probably have some closed loop things that will work, and I'm happy for it. And yes, the answer is drivers would be out of work. You'd have fewer people driving. Your TNCs would now be autonomous. The answer is yes, but it wouldn't stop congestion. It wouldn't stop the addition of adding ozone problems. So that is a problem, and I think many people are recognizing that there would be a loss of drivers if these autonomous vehicles were very successful. And you could shrink transit a little bit. This micro transit could be a great thing if you could be in a closed loop and not have the dangers of weather, a pavement, or other physical kind of objects making it a problem in the open road. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but it is a problem because you're going to lose a lot of drivers.
John, do you have any answer to that?
Yeah, I mean, if we ever get to the day where there's autonomous, vehicles and that can run on their own without any type of intervention in the real world environment, and then it's an incredible game changer for transit agencies, because the primary cost driver for us are our drivers. They're the human beings that move the vehicles are the primary cost. It's not the cost of the bus. It's not a cost of operating that bus, from gas and maintenance. It's the human being driving. It doesn't matter if it's a humongous bus or a tiny car. It's the fact that there's a human being doing that work. And I'll do a quick tangent. And it's assuming that you want to pay that human being a living wage, right? The only way that VIA is any better than a taxi or what we would have done before is that we're offloading the cost of, benefits and a responsible wage, and hoping that private company will do right by those drivers, which I don't know what VIA's contracts look like. I only know that they're paying less than we pay, and I don't think they're getting benefits from a lot of these TNCs. And so, the cost of the driver and paying them a living wage is what makes transit more expensive than what private companies would do. And so, yes, if we could get to a place where autonomous vehicles could do it themselves, great. I have no illusion that that's happening anytime while I'm responsible for planning our system and don't want to even and frankly, it's not worth the conversation because it takes our eyes off the ball of, the reality that we're currently in and the decisions we need to make right now, over the next decade or so. And so it's a dream. It would be great, not for our drivers necessarily, unless we could, put them into other types of, positions like maintenance and customer service and all those other things. But from the public and what they would receive, they could likely get a lot more services for the money that we have. And so hopefully one day that comes, but it's not happening anytime soon, in my opinion.
So there was a comment from the person that gave that question, and I'll just read their comment. They said that we have SAVs, shared autonomous vehicles, already operating in Arlington, although it's a pilot project as of now.
Yeah, it's very small areas. Same thing in Frisco. They had a pilot with some shared autonomous vehicles. That pilot kind of came and went and kind of closed up. It's just not, it's not ready for the real world environment at any scalable way. But again, if it comes, obviously a game changer. But it's a lot more fun to talk about, I think, in theoretical terms than from a do we need to put that in the budget 3 or 4 years from now way. That's a different kind of conversation.
So
well, and it'll probably come to fixed route buses and trains before it would come to, because you're on a route where you can more easily plan the infrastructure. You can't plan for the weather, and if that bus is stopped because it's snowing in Denver, well, guess what? You miss your connection, and it's not going to work. And that's what happened again with the RTD study in 2018. It's just not that reliable.
So we have a question in the chat, and this one is, and I'm really bad at my acronyms, so I'm sure you know what this is. How does ROI relate to equity?
I brought it up. Yeah, let me suggest that was something that one of the mayoral candidates talked to me about. And, you just got to take the politicians where you find them. But to me, ROI didn't mean return on income, return on investment. And getting a job, having a job, is that return. That's what I want. I'm not looking for, well, I am looking for TOD. Look at what Grapevine has done. Look at what North Richland Hills is doing. Magnificent jobs. And my hat's off to DART. I mean, say what you will about not getting people to where they need to go. They've developed a really heck of a transit-oriented development system. It took time. A lot of things didn't work, but they stuck with it. And Jack Krasinski over there has done a great job with orchestrating the transit-oriented development for DART. My hat's off to him. So I look at it's a return on investment, it's a job. It's getting somebody to a hospital. It's a number of visits you make to your grocery store. That's my return. And also getting that return so that you can justify the investment financially. I'm telling you, if you invest in public transportation, you're going to get a return in many different ways.
Yeah, that's such a great point, because when you provide transit, you're right. There is a return on investment, especially to the community at large, right? More people are working, so they can pay their bills. They might be able to buy a home. They can send their kids to school. There's a greater return on investment, right? I mean, it might not be, so who's it going to? Is there a greater return on investment to the transit company or whatever, but to the society as a whole? You can count those dollars. The more people have access. Yeah. So,
yeah, John, and you give a speech, okay, and guess what? I give a different speech to people who are looking for economic development from transit-oriented successes versus someone trying to get a job, and because they're just different needs and different successes. But by and large, if you're not doing it as a major city, if you're not in a big way committed to public transportation, you will not attract the kind of workforce you want to attract. You just won't do it anymore. You're not going to get the corporate headquarters that you're longing to get and compete for. And with a shrinking birth rate, with all of the different, we're going to grow But how are we going to grow in North Texas? Are we going to grow with better paying jobs, or are we just going to limp by?
John?
So my reaction to just hearing return on investment, I get anxious and cautious depending on who I hear asking that question, what I think their motivation might be, right? Because it's really easy. I think you said earlier in the conversation about, well, now I lost my train of thought. Sorry, Dr. Allen. I was going to say the idea and the question of how do you value transit and not it should be subsidized. That's where I was going. Is it really depends on your point of view and your perspective on this, because depends on what you're asking that vehicle and that bus to do. If we are trying to run a coverage service, right, something that is we're going to run in an area that is not particularly dense, but we want to serve that community because they pay sales tax like everyone else. We're probably going to run it, less frequently than we would otherwise and spend less money on it. But do we hold that up and measure it the same way as we would measure a high frequency bus and try to grade those on the same scale? Of course you wouldn't, because we're asking transit to do two different things in that case, right? When we build our Silver Line project and complete what is that entire corridor and connect with TexRail, that project is not designed inherently to produce a ton of ridership. Yes, people will ride it. There are stops along the way that are valuable to those communities. Of course, there's the airport that we connect to, but that was not ever designed to move 30, 40,000 people a day with the alignment that was chosen at that time and the frequencies that we're putting on it. And so it would be inappropriate to look at return on investment based purely on ridership. But if you're looking at it also through an economic development lens, right, through a political lens, the return on investment changes depending on how you're looking at that sort of thing. So I think it's really important that at least we just be clear and articulate what kind of return on investment that we're looking for. But most importantly, at the end of the day, we are a transit agency. We are not, some economic development corporation that the cities put together a long time ago that happens to also move people sometimes, right? Cities can build their own economic development corporation if that's what they want. Right? We're not a construction arm of the city. We are here to move people. And that's pretty much it. Like if there are other ancillary benefits that come along with that, that benefit the city, that's great. We know that will be the case, right? Mockingbird Station was not on anyone's mind when we built the system or agreed to the system in 1983. Just so happens it's a great location. We built a corridor there. It comes by fairly frequently and things kind of sprouted up, partially because of DART, partially because it's on 75 and Mockingbird. We'll take the credit for it, certainly, right? We did build a thing and it is there. But first and foremost, we want to move people and get them to Mockingbird Station as opposed to saying that we want to take credit for that. It's a byproduct of making good transit decisions. And so if we make good transit decisions, there'll be a good return on investment depending on how we talk about it. And so if we decide to go into a community that is not particularly dense and serve it according to what we try to do, which is to provide limited access to make sure people still have some way to get out of that transit desert, then that's a success. Like that is a high return on investment for the dollars that we spent to serve that particular purpose, right? As long as we don't say, hey, that subsidy per passenger is way higher than the high frequency bus, and try to take away that service because of that reason, then I think we're fine, like with what we're trying to do. So that's how I like to think about return on investment is just, parsing it out and being clear about what kind of return that we're looking to get so that we don't end up degrading and talking to the detriment of transit if something's wrong with the transit we're doing, because it's likely serving a very specific purpose. We may not all agree with it. Like I'm not a fan of some of the things that we may do as an agency, but they serve important goals, right? Either economic development or political. And so, we support them as a board, but just let's be clear about why we're doing what we're doing so that we can measure it appropriately.
Great. So it looks like we have plenty of time. We still have 30 minutes. And I want to say to everyone who's part of joining us here that your questions have been great. So you can send more questions. I'm gonna, there's another question in the Q&A, and then I'll ask a question. So the next question is, how can we as a community better gather accurate data, quantitative and qualitative, and then apply that data to make a positive impact in transportation equity for all? So I think you touched a little bit on this already, Jeff. So if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, I believe in data, and I look at the number of people that TNCs move, which is, in Arlington, they don't tell you how many they move, and they won't tell you how many they move, but it's typically probably 2 or 3 an hour. And that kind of data is important to me when you're looking at costs and when you're looking at coverage, which is something John rightly pointed out. So I like to take data to, you take this, someone from, I think Harvard wrote this paper about the greatest predictor of whether or not you're going to be able to get out of poverty is your commute time. You got to think about those data points and how that really does affect your direction of policy making. So I take whatever data I can, in this case with the TNCs, how many people buses will move and microtransit. And I take it every day. I go to the council members and I go to the mayors and I say, hey, here's the data. We can get demographic data fairly easily. But what we can do is get the funding to get what we need as a community to get more frequent service, to cover more transit deserts where we don't have the money, to build what we can to increase economic development in your cultural district area in the north side and your south side circulators. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question on data, but it's really important for me to be able to show jobs, trips taken, ridership, not so much, except as it relates to major corridors. And you have to educate people with that kind of data. And that's what I spend a lot of time doing, because we get 6 people who ride a VIA in a day. Well, guess what? They all went to a doctor's office. Well, is that a good use of your money? Well, yeah, it really probably is, because you're performing that important service. So I use data. I'm a junkie for whatever anybody sends me. I read it and I try and distribute it and send it out to basically the political leaders in Tarrant County. And you know what? Some of them listen. And the more we get, and I talked before about getting data on costs for roads and get more information about economic development, I'll be in their face every day telling them and showing them how to move people, how to do it the most efficiently, with the difference between the shiny object and moving people. And there are numerous examples of how data will really assist a project.
Yes. John?
Yeah, like I said, my background is in business intelligence, and it is around helping companies take and ingest all the data that they get and then turn it into some kind of useful information. And knowing that as a day job, right, it really only is as good of a tool if you actually have a vision and a desire to do something with it once you get it, right? Like, one, do you have a point of view before you get the data around what you hope to have happen, right? Like, there may just be basic descriptive data. How many riders did we have yesterday? Where were they going? Who's riding? Like, those are things that those are just kind of quantifiable, pure numbers that you can capture. But if the perspective of the agency and the board members and the city is basically that, hey, we have all the money that we have to spend on this, and we don't need to spend any more, right? Like, even if we have some extra money in reserve, let's save it instead of spend it. It doesn't matter what kind of data that you present, because those decision makers and those people already have in their mind that, that there's not much more that we can do. And so we can try our best, which is, I think, earlier question, which was around like the research, how can we maybe try to change those folks' minds? That's a little bit different when you're trying to overcome, a resistance or people who may be set in their thought patterns, right? I can speak as a board member. One thing that I would find very helpful in terms of our decision making is that you'd be surprised at how little we actually talk about moving people at the transit board level. We talk much more about contracts and ILAs and brake parts and any number of things outside of, hey, is ridership down over the last 2 weeks, and our drivers, are they getting there on time, and how many accidents did we have in the past couple of weeks? Those are actually not numbers that we spend a great deal of time on. Like, there may be a quick presentation on them, or it may be in an appendix somewhere, but those sorts of data points actually are not what we spend the bulk of our time on, and frankly, we probably need to change that a bit, because that's the sort of thing that absolutely does matter, because again, that's what we do. That is oftentimes much more important than maybe some long discussion about our marketing plan and how many likes we got on the last campaign that we just did, right? Like sometimes we spend an hour talking about that sort of thing. So so the data and the kinds of insights I think that we can get are really important to help us make better decisions, but it still all comes back down to who are the people in the seats making those decisions, and how can we influence them to possibly start caring about this issue more, which is that's a lot less about data and a lot more about storytelling. That's a lot more about the insight, because you would be better convincing someone that there's a problem if you explain, I'm going to use the Alliance example because Jeff used it, right? If you explain that there are, 25, there's a group of mothers who are looking to get back into work post-pandemic, and there are these great jobs up at Alliance, but they live in East Fort Worth, and they can't get from Rosedale all the way up to Alliance because we don't have a transit system that gets them there quickly and reliably. And so instead, they walk to the nearest fast food restaurant that pays them half of what they could make, right? Like, yeah, you could come up with all the charts in the world that explain that and show them maps and all that kind of stuff. But if you can have a narrative and a story that communicates what that data ultimately bears out, that's going to change the hearts and minds of our decision makers, I think, much more quickly than it would data after data after data. Like, the data is important. We need it. We need to be able to support our decisions, because when it gets to money, someone's always going to ask, again, go back to the ROI. But the thing that's going to jumpstart the conversation is explaining that someone has a 2.5-hour journey to get to a job, as opposed to, showing it on a map that it's that long of a journey.
That is so
Well said.
That's so important and true. I mean, when I was doing my research on transit deserts, I looked at both quantitative, looking at the demographics and looking at, the stop locations and frequency and how long it took people and where they were going. But the most powerful stuff was the qualitative data. And I got people's stories. And actually one story, the story this person told me actually made a difference. It actually got them to put an additional line in New Orleans East where this person was. It was a woman who worked at the casino downtown, and they had like a point system. So if you were late for work, you got so many points and then you lost your job. But it so happened that many people, this was post-Katrina, when they reduced the lines, like after COVID, when they reduced lines, which was crazy, when they reduced lines post-Katrina. So there was like only 2 lines in New Orleans East, which is far, where a lot of the minority population lives and commutes to the downtown. They reduced lines. And so this woman had to get up at 4:30 to get to a 7:30 job. And she still would be late because she had to transfer because of the reduction of lines, and then wait for the streetcar, which they reduced because there weren't as many tourists at that time. And so what happened is, everybody who lived out there was getting points. And so the casino people went to the RTA and said, look, we will pay half their bus passes if you put a line out there. And it took, these people, like the woman who told me, she said she had to get up in front of the employees and talk about what happens to her. And then they got the RTA, Regional Road Transit Authority in New Orleans, to put an extra line because of that that story, that qualitative data, which is like really important, which, we use a lot as researchers, surveys and listening to people's stories. So yeah, that is important, both kinds. And like you said, people's stories, on the ground really make a difference. So we have a bunch more questions now. So we have what role, well, here's another question, and then I'll go back to that, which is also relating to data. Are there quantitative measures on our transit plans? So this is like looking at data after you've done the measure, that allow us to know that we are moving toward our equity goals. So kind of more like, I guess, assessment data. So are there quantitative measures on our transit plans that allow us to know that we're moving toward these equity goals? So Jeff, do you want to, have you all done
Sometimes, well, sometimes there isn't. I mean, how do you, we show a number of trips, as I mentioned, to doctor's visits, on access, to COVID vaccination sites, to job interviews. That's data that we have, that we use regularly, and it, it's the ROI for me, getting people to where they need to go. I mean, it's to the grocery store, to church. So taking something quantitatively, and we show that every month about how many trips we take. But that isn't exactly an increase in ridership that people are always seem to be looking for. Or, with COVID, my goodness, public transportation is down at least 50%. And oh, by the way, walking and biking is up 73% in the North Texas region. So there's a silver lining there. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but we try and put the light on it, the best light that we can, to show that we're serving a population that needs to be served.
So John, are you all doing any kind of assessment or collecting data that show that you're moving towards transit equity?
Right. So I'm going to say no, but that's because we don't have any transit equity goals that have been articulated recently, right? We're going through our system redesign. We're being much more clear about what difference between ridership and coverage, amount of spending that we put on those. We are making the deliberate choice to continue spending the same amount of money post redesign as we were spending pre-redesign in each city. So if, Cockrell Hill, which is a small city inside of Dallas, whatever money we were spending before, we're going to keep spending. Maybe it looks a little different, but that's one way to have equity, is just equity between, the city resources that we put towards transit, right? You can make a very strong argument that some communities probably need less service and some need much more. But again, from a political standpoint, it was important for us to ensure that everybody continues to get the same amount that they were getting before, right? So that's one way that we can show equity. Then that maybe competes with another form of equity, which is making sure that people who need it most get more of it. Those are competing odds, and we've leaned towards, serving all of our cities similarly. I think post launch, and as we're going through and measuring, we will probably come up with new standards that speak to equity, right? So for instance, we are going to significantly grow our on-demand services, right? I think we're going to be we're going to have the largest area of on-demand of anyone in the country. We're going to have tremendous landmass that's served by on-demand transit. Well, from an equitable standpoint, if we put more services like that in Plano, and that allows those residents to get someone to pick them up within a 5-minute request, but in South Dallas, we spend less money and resources and say, hey, you got buses, so don't worry about an on-demand that can pick you up at your door. Go walk 3 blocks to a bus that comes every 30 minutes, right? Well, then you got to, if you don't measure that and have a desire to say, you know what, we want to make sure everybody's weight is similar, right? That we don't give anyone such superior services that you can't scale it and you can't sustain it. Well, right now we don't have that as a particular goal. Like, that is not written down anywhere. And so you can't measure yourself, or at least you can measure it, but you can't hold anybody accountable if we never actually say, we want every on-demand community to get the same level of performance, right? Or we want to ensure, again, it's not written as an equity goal, but if West Dallas never has any drivers that don't show up to work, their on-time performance is always 95%. But, North Dallas, that transit center, for whatever reason, those guys never show up to work and those girls never show up to work. And so, they're only 75% on-time performance. Well, it doesn't matter what you put on the map and say, hey, these are all 15-minute buses and they all come all the time. Well, if your buses don't actually come every 15 minutes because of breakdowns or no shows, then you don't have an equitable system, right? Like you say you do on paper, but when it comes to measuring it, you don't. And so like those are two examples that I can give that I know there are ways you can measure it, but there's not actually any accountability or goals set with it. And so I think as we do this relaunch and have to scrap all of our old ideas about measurements, and I'm sure Fort Worth is probably thinking of it too, like we have to scrap what we thought was a good way to measure a bus before, because all of them were lumped together and said they all had the same subsidy per passenger goal. Well, now that we know those buses are performing different tasks, we don't want to hold them to the same standard, right, and the same goal. And so as we go through and review all that in our service standards and determine, what makes sense, if we have an equity and justice framework, it makes it much, much easier to hold it to account, right? Whether it's bus shelters or on-time performance or who gets to have a digital kiosk installed first versus another community. All those things are just happening right now, right? And sometimes we think about equity, sometimes we don't. And so I'm hopeful that again, with a new CEO and a different kind of energy around these conversations, like we'll be able to actually have a whole framework and have goals like specific to equity, so that every piece of our agency we make sure our decisions are made that way.
Did you have a follow-up, Jeff? No.
It's this kind of measurement is difficult sometimes because of the issue of ridership and coverage. And, DART has a lot more money, and our whole culture at Trinity Metro it revolves around moving people to their jobs in the lower income areas, because that's all the money we've got. And I want to talk briefly about the struggle that we have at Trinity Metro, and for people who are transit advocates, the Transit Alliance group. We had an ask last September of the City Council in Fort Worth for $10 million, all of it related to social equity, getting people to their jobs. We had a zip zone TNC service that would have done much better at servicing a particularly lower income neighborhood. We had frequency on a Hispanic route in South Fort Worth that was desperately needed. We had many other asks of the city, and they didn't even give us a sniff. It wasn't as if we were asking for another Tex rail extension. It was just $10 million to give some social equity to our mission. And it fell on deaf ears, and it could have been their budgetary constraints, but even the minorities on the council just didn't even give us the time of day. So all I'm suggesting to you is that somehow there needs to be a connection between those people who are making decisions with the money. There needs to be the data and the storytelling to get them to really understand what we're doing. And in Tarrant County, we've been successful with the local newspapers. They've been huge in talking about what transit can do for transit deserts, what they can do for economic development, telling the stories that John was mentioning. So let me suggest that that's a great way to connect with your political leaders through the newspaper.
Yeah, I'm putting some pressure on people. So a follow-up question actually to that is, what role does fair policy play in transit justice? What do you think about fare free transit or policies to decriminalize fare evasion? Very interesting question. Okay, who wants to talk?
I'll go first this time. This is an issue that is near and dear to my heart. One of the first policies that I was able to successfully shepherd through the dartboard from start to finish was around a low income fare policy. And I'd start with, I think, the easiest thing probably for every agency to get towards, which is decriminalizing fare evasion. It's a very tedious and expensive thing to do to try to chase down and get someone to pay that can't afford to pay, right? Like if they can't afford your $2 fare, they're probably not going to pay the $25 ticket. And they're probably not going to they're going to dismiss that ticket themselves and then end up with a warrant for a misdemeanor that becomes $150. It snowballs and there's just no point to it. That's how it works in Dallas. And that's by state law. We have to give them a ticket. And if they don't pay it, I think within 30 days, we have to send it to the justice of the peace. It's not up to us whether or not we do that. We can have like administrative, ways to resolve it. But at the end of the day, if they don't take care of the ticket that we give them, then then eventually it could end up in a case of a warrant. And we do those by the tens of thousands every year. And almost none of them actually get resolved. So it's like you do this loop almost to just, to have this system where you want to say, hey, we're charging and we want you to know we're charging. So we spend a lot of money on people on our light rail system to be there to check your fare and then write you a ticket if you don't have it. And it's a lot of money to spend when we know generally across the country, like 95% of people are effectively on the honor system and are paying their fares anyway. And so the question is, do you want to spend a lot of time and resources to chase down that small percent? Like you're going to spend a lot more to try to collect on that, 3 to 5% of people who were probably never going to pay anyway. They just wouldn't ride the system if they knew someone was there, than to try to go through the whole judicial process. And again, it's just a lot of money to do that sort of thing. When you have to ask yourself, to what end, right? Like fares don't actually make up a big portion of our budget. It's less than 10% of our operating budget anyway. And so from just like, what are we doing about fare evasion? I think even if you don't want to have the conversation about fare-free transit, you can at least get to a place where you say, hey, we really shouldn't spend a lot of time and resources trying to chase down those folks who are by and large more likely to be low income, that can't afford it. And so maybe think of other ways where you can make the transit affordable for those individuals, right? Like, so why weren't we previously offering low income individuals half price fares when we very well could have, right? Those are things that we could do instead. The conversation about fare free is a fun one to have, as long as you're willing to acknowledge that, if for in DART's instance, if we, forego fare, we probably leave $50 million a year on the table in terms of the fares that we get in. That probably is offset some by like federal formula funds for more people riding. But, you leave some money on the table. And so the question is it better to have that money to produce and provide more services? Or would we likely just be a better system overall if it was like our regular infrastructure where you get on, ride, and don't worry about it? I don't know. We haven't had that conversation at the DART board. I think it'd be a fun one to have. I think I see one of my colleagues, Patrick Kennedy, joining. So welcome, Patrick. Please type in the chat what you think so I can decide which way I'm leaning. Yeah, the fares are a big part of a big part of what we spend a lot of time on. But like I said, it's less than 10% of our operating budget, and so we could certainly do better. And we need to have more conversations about simplifying our fare and making it cheaper for folks. But going all the way to fare free, I don't know.
And not wrecking someone's life by sending them to jail or whatever because they didn't pay $1.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. The one thing I would say is like one of the simplest things you can do is if they're not paying and you don't want to go through the hoopla, just ask them to step off, the bus or the train. Say, hey, if you can't afford it, we don't want to send you to court. We don't want to do all that. Like, can't afford it, just step off. Saves everyone a bunch of time. We don't have to write tickets. We don't have to do this big dance. that's one way of handling that. It's a lot simpler and less friction than the whole ticket scenario thing that we currently do an awful lot of at DART.
Okay, Jeff?
It's complicated. It's just, and we certainly, whatever John said, we're in that same boat. We don't have a lower income fare because we haven't been able to get Harrison on the bus yet. So our fare on TexRail is $2.50. You know, that's a pretty reasonable fare to have a vehicle like that take you to DFW. And in Denver, that same ride is $12. So, you know, we are consciously keep our fares as low as we can. It's about 10% of our budget too. We rely mostly on the honor system, and we've thought about the free fare thing, and it's just something that we just haven't elected to go to yet because of all of the kinds of things it means, and people riding that don't really want to ride. They're just going to want a place to go. And the goal is to make it as safe as we can for everybody and as clean as you can. And so some amount of money is probably going to work to keep people that would abuse the system off the system, off the bus, off the train, even if it's $1, if it's something that they really thought they had to do. And we don't give out as many tickets. That's not our goal. They don't even check. I shouldn't say this, but I don't remember the last time TRE checked a ticket. So it's complicated, and we all want free fares, and we all want everybody to be happy. But it's when you start talking about safety, when you start talking about cleanliness, you start talking about people riding for no objective except just to have a place to go, then that really detracts from the quality of service you give.
So I just want to say that I think that there's some examples where free fares have been used strategically, not through the whole system. And you mentioned Denver, but now that I realize, although I've read on that rail, I didn't realize it was $12, but maybe that's why they charge $12, because they have 16th Street bus, which is like a main artery in the downtown, and it's free. But they do that because it links to the light rail, it links to other, so everything that connects to it, you pay, but that one piece is free. And then there's a couple of cities that recently have been giving people like these free cards, like, because a lot of people don't have credit cards, so they give them kind of like a EDT card. But it's for transit, right? And it allows them to take Uber to like the main transit. So they use it to get from their house to like, you know, if the transit is a couple of miles away, so they get a free card so they can get Uber. So I guess the city's like paying Uber so that these people have this kind of free card that they use to get, you know. So there are ways to use that strategically. I've looked at cities using, but not having the whole system free, but ways to increase transit and maybe people to help them with the last couple of miles to get to transit, or to like be a catalyst. That's what the 16th Street free bus is, kind of a catalyst for the rest of transit. So there's kind of ways to do it, but that's interesting quandary. So we have 2 more questions because we're at 11:25, so we have 5 more minutes, and I actually want to give you all just a few minutes to wrap, you know, give us a little closing. Something we might have missed. You know, I always feel like, you know, I know when I'm on a panel, there's something I really wanted to say and they didn't ask me. So I want to give you that. These last 2 questions are transit equity. What city in America gets it done best? So what do you think? What city do you think does the best transit equity? Either one of you have a city?
I can go quickly, and I'm going to say I don't know. As much as I look to see what other cities are up to in terms of, you know, their redesigns or, you know, their fare policies. I think because transit equity is such a new framework and idea that I haven't seen anything that speaks to that and says, like, look at all the things that this city is doing in particular. So while one may have a great policy around fares or fare evasion, or, you know, its own low income program, or how they're doing security, I hadn't seen it in such a great way in terms of like an all encompassing. So while you may look at Seattle and say they're doing a great job in reinvesting in their bus system, and Philadelphia is doing a great job with how they handle the homeless, and San Francisco has great low income fare policies. I don't know that I would look at any one of them individually and say they're doing a phenomenal job. I would say now that now's a good time to look at DART. I think we are going to make a big push in terms of taking an equitable lens through different things. We have a brand new CEO. We have a bunch of money that we got from the federal government to help fund different programs and ideas that we may decide to take on. And so I'd say look out for us and hold us accountable to becoming a much more equitable system that hopefully becomes the envy of everyone else around the nation.
Jeff? You're muted.
I haven't, as John, haven't looked at other cities through that lens, but I would think that cities like Seattle, when you spend $54 billion on public transportation, or Houston, who has also spent a great deal of money in a recent election, when you spend that kind of money, it means you're really trying to service your lower income folks, really paying attention to what the needs are. And those are the cities I look to, Austin, and actually taking their hit on their general revenue for 7 or 8 cents, committing to transit. Those are the kinds of cities I would think have a understanding of how important it is. I would think Dallas certainly would be one of those cities. Fort Worth is a little further behind in that understanding, and that's my cross to bear, and I just have to keep sending the message as best I can to the political leaders to keep spending, and we just don't have the funds. The city isn't giving us the funds.
Yeah, that's an interesting and difficult question because I've looked at, I've looked at cities across the country, and transit availability doesn't always equal equity, because you would think the answer would be New York, Philadelphia, DC, all those places have transit. Baltimore, they have buses, they have light rail, they have, subways, because they have tons of stuff, but it's not always equitable. Like even in New York, like if you're in Manhattan in certain parts, but you get out to other parts, it's really harder. I mean, Baltimore's right. They're going through a thing because of, they have all this stuff going like from north south to get people in the suburbs in, but then people traveling through have a harder time. And availability, there are places like Chicago that, there's lots of transit, but is it equitable, right? Is every place served, in the margins that, because equitable is not equal, right? It's not that it's available, like it's based on the need. So that's an interesting question. Oh, it's 11:30. I'm so sorry to the last person who had a question that I didn't get to answer, but we apologize for that. Good.
Well, I'd like to thank Dr. Allen, Jon Killen, and Jeff Davis for this really interesting panel. I think it's a great conversation, and we'll hopefully have a lot more of these going forward. Anyone who has any additional questions, you can send those to the CTED email or Twitter, and I can pass them around to the experts.